Good morning. Alright, so we're going to finish chapter 4 and make a start on chapter 5 today. Does anybody have any questions about the information in chapter 4 that we covered on Tuesday before I continue? No. Is that Isabel? Anybody else? Kevin? Jackson?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Alright, let's see. Oh no, I think the batteries are dying in the mouse now. Come on, you little thing.
It's the wrong plastic.
I didn't even know there were batteries in here. Perhaps the switch is just now. Okay, so we were looking at motor milestones. And we got to 9 months, so remember we were starting to either creep on hands and knees or bum scoot on bottom, pulling along with their heels, depending upon the constraints of the environment in the house. And by about 9 months or so, our little one is able to pull themselves up to stand, but they can't stand unassisted, so they have to hold on. Because when they first start standing up, you've got these weird things here called hips, right, that they haven't used yet before this point. And you probably can picture in your head what a hip joint looks like. It's one of the most mobile joints that we have in our bodies. So when they first start to stand up, there's all this, there's all this movement going on that they have to learn to control in order to stand still, right? Because they haven't used these muscles to control their hip joints until they get to this point, right? So they're very kind of woo for a little while. It takes them a bit to get there. So let's have a look. How do I? No. So let's have a look at this bit of film clip here. That's on this one. So creeping, someone's playing with a very fun looking toy. I'm going to stand up, whoop, whoop. Right, so you can see lots of wibbly wobbly going on here, but they're very curious, so they want to see what's up on the chair, or if someone's got a toy there, they want to get there, and they're getting strong enough, so now their legs are strong enough to hold their weight if they can just control this wibbly wobbly hip joint. Right? So it takes a little bit of time for the brain to learn which muscle groups to turn on to stabilize the hip joints. Very cute. Okay, so then once they've kind of got up and they're a little bit more steady, again, depending upon the environment, you might see them start what we call cruising the furniture. And cruising is when they're holding on and they're going sideways, right? They'll move their hands and then they'll move their feet and they're going like this across the furniture. So if you've got a nice long couch, then they can cruise along the couch or a long coffee table, something like that. So what we see here is, again, the environment, the amount of furniture that is in the room, for example, is going to impact the cruising behavior, right? Because if it's a very long way from the coffee table to the next surface that's the right height for me to cruise on, then I'm going to drop back down to my hands and knees and creep over and pull myself back up again. So the amount of space in the room might impact how much cruising you see, right? So they pull themselves up around 9 months. It takes about 3 to 4 weeks for the brain to work out this hip joint and balance and for the legs to build up a little bit of strength. And hopefully by about 10 months on average, they're able to stand on their own unsupported. And again, that's an average. You could see that a little bit earlier or it might be a little bit later. Okay. And then again, on average, about 8 weeks of practice at standing, we start to see walking alone. So when they're standing on their own, and then they're going to be walking with the help of mum or dad, and then by about 12 months on average, they're going to start walking on their own. Okay. That can be anything from 8 or 9 months at walking, right? So some children walk very, very early. Some children skip the creeping, bum scooting and go straight to standing up and walking. It's not very typical, but it does happen. And the later kind of cut-off is around 15 months. So if the baby's not walking by 15 months, then the pediatrician is probably going to want to do some investigations. You know, that's really pushing the limit the other end. Okay. So, weeks ago now, we talked about rate limiters. Remember that a rate limiter is an individual constraint that at the early end of the childhood is going to be the individual constraint that delays the development of the next skill, right? So it slows down. It's the last thing to develop that is needed for that skill. And at the other end of the lifespan, the rate limiter is going to be the first system to degrade to a critical point that a movement can't occur anymore, right? So it depends which end of the lifespan you are, right? And these individual constraints are changing rapidly during this period of time. Remember our growth curve, right? That growth curve during year 1, and then it's a little bit less in year 2, but not much. Everything is changing very, very quickly, right? So we've got massive changes in motor patterns if we watch carefully during this time, because remember our constraints triangle, every time we change a constraint, we change the interaction of the constraints, and therefore we would expect to see a slightly different observable movement pattern. Okay. So sometimes individual constraints can be impacted by environmental scenarios. All right, so the book talks about an environmental cultural constraint that some children in the States deal with. It's called first child syndrome. And first child syndrome is one of those scenarios where the parent is either nervous or very enveloping, maybe a little OTT with the taking care of, and they carry the baby around on their hip the whole time, right? They don't like to put the baby down and walk away, so they just take the baby with them all the time, okay? So what that does, though, is it removes the opportunity for the baby to develop enough strength to pull itself up to stand and start walking. So sometimes those children who've been carried around a lot have a little delay in their standing up and their walking patterns. Okay? Typically doesn't happen by the time you get to child 2, because now you're too busy managing 2 children to carry one around on your hip. So that's why it's called first child syndrome. Right? What else have we got about rate limiters? Let me think. Sometimes the previous motor milestone and the strength that that milestone is developing can act as the rate limiter to the next skill. So walking challenges a child's balance a lot. Once they start to walk, they have to learn to shift their center of gravity that we talked about in chapter 3. They've got to shift their weight around, right? So their balance can impact walking behavior, right? Balance is a individual constraint, right? So sometimes the child will revert to other behaviors. So when it was standing up, for example, at 10 months, at 11 months, you might have seen it reaching with one hand for a toy that was on the coffee table or the couch, right? When it starts walking and its balance is more challenged than it was standing still, you might see them revert back to reaching with 2 hands for a toy. And then as they get more practice, they go back to reaching with 1 hand, for example. I feel like I'm losing my voice. So the motor milestones are important points to look for, right? Because they're representing typical development for that infant, right? And if the infant isn't reaching those motor milestones, then there could be something atypical going on, right? And we have to address those as quickly as we can, because delays to motor development, because motor development interacts with everything else, right? It can delay their cognitive development, right? Because if they're not able to move around comfortably and investigate things, then they're not exploring, they're not using their brains, right? They're not stimulating that little brain to grow and develop synapses and a really good wiring system. It could delay their fundamental motor skills, right? And we know that those are a problem. If those are delayed, then we can't pick up later types of movement skills. It can delay sensory integration, so understanding, you know, what I'm touching or what I'm seeing is different if I move over here than if I move over here, right? So without movement, it's very difficult to integrate sensory, particularly visual information. Okay. All right. So there's a lot of research on postural control and balance in infancy. They look at the conflict between the kinesthetic information that the child is receiving and the visual information and the kinesthetic information. So sometimes those don't match, right? At 2 months old, so about 8 weeks old, they're pretty good at reacting to visual information. So if you sit them in a chair and you move your hand towards their face, they will sway a little bit. And the more experience they get with moving and standing and walking, the more the postural reactions occur quickly, right? So here's a problem. If my vision and then I don't respond by tightening up the muscles, I fall over. Okay. So after about a year of walking experience, we see less falling with them. Adults have a similar response, but if you're a healthy young adult, then your postural reaction to the sensory information is quick enough to prevent you falling over. But then it gets really interesting again as we look later in the lifespan, because the postural reaction starts to slow down, and that puts older people at more risk of falling. So let me show you this piece of fun film. Why did I come over here? I can do it here if this is working. Green is not. This piece. Okay, can you see this film? Hopefully you can hear it.
Visual information in maintaining balance. In most adults, even when doing a difficult task, the sway is small and balance is easily maintained. But if visual information is important, then it should be possible to upset a subject's balance in an experimental room by moving the room gently forwards or backwards. Infants learning to stand are less stable than the adult and far more easily put off balance. The infant in this experiment has only been walking for a month. When we move the room backwards, the child falls. And again. In 92 trials of this type, 7 infants, balance was clearly disturbed in the predicted direction in 82% of the trials. It seems then that for the infant learning to maintain balance, visual information is far more potent than mechanical information. But the adult, however, is less sensitive to conflict between visual and mechanical information, and movements of the room do not, as with the infant, knock him over. But let us give him an unfamiliar balancing task, such as standing on a narrow beam. With his eyes closed, he depends solely on mechanical stimuli, quickly becomes unstable and falls off. Or, with his eyes open, if the room is moved, even slightly, he will lose his balance, just as the infant did.
Oops. Stop
trying to lose belly fat.
We go. All right. So what we're looking at there is the idea that as the child is learning to control their postural muscles and keep themselves on balance, so we'll go back if you can't remember, right? Let's go back to chapter 3 and remember that to stay on balance, I have to keep my center of gravity above my base of support. So that baby's brain is doing a lot of work learning how to keep the center of gravity over the base of support. And they, in the research terms, we call this coupling of the sensory information with the, what they call mechanical, we call kinesthetic information. So humans are very visually dominant, and we tend to rely too much on our visual information and not pay enough attention to our sensory information. So you may have had the experience either sitting in your car or maybe sitting on a plane at the gate waiting to pull back, that you're sitting at the on the plane and the plane at the next gate rolls back and you feel like you're moving, right? That's because your peripheral vision caught that plane moving back, and your brain listens to your visual information instead of all the kinesthetic information that is telling your brain, you didn't go anywhere, you're sitting still, right? So it's an interesting dilemma, the visual dominance thing, and I think it makes it really important that we recognize that we don't listen enough to our kinesthetic info, and we do work with our children, with our PE students, with our athletes. We do a lot more closed eye work, right? Even if it's just making them turn around in a circle with their eyes closed, or walk forwards and walk backwards with their eyes closed, right? We should do more work, in my view, with eyes closed, so that the brain starts to pay more attention to all the other information it's getting from the body, right? Okay. Questions on chapter 4. It's very interesting watching young children because you can literally see their brains problem solving. How do I move this body? How do I keep this body on balance? Right? So you'll notice the little baby, when they moved the room towards her, fell over backwards. When they moved the room away, she fell forwards. Right? It's all that visual stimulus. And then we have to react to that stimulus, and the brain wasn't reacting fast enough with the postural control. Right? It takes time to get there, and practice, right? So lots of experience at walking in different situations, walking on different surfaces, walking downhill, walking uphill, right? The more experience we give the brain, the more options it's got for controlling things. Okay. All right. So we're going to start chapter 5, and we're just going to continue looking at this development, and we're going to stick with locomotion to begin with. So we're going to look at some of the locomotor skills on the TGMD and the MSU chart. All right. So go here. So, locomotion. The word locomotion just means that I'm moving from one place to another place. It doesn't define how I'm moving, all right? So, as a human, I can move on one leg, I can move on 2 legs, I can move on 2 hands, I can move on 4 limbs and use my arms and my legs, right? So we've got lots of options for moving around in our environment. We can crawl, and crawling means I'm dragging myself along on my tummy, right? We can creep, we can walk, we can run, we can hop, or skip, or gallop, right? There's lots of versions of locomotion that we can use, okay? Swimming is also locomotion, right? Bear walking, so on hands and feet, is locomotion, right? So moving from place to place is a very simplistic definition of locomotion, but the actual activity itself is very complex from a motor perspective, right? And using our constraints triangle helps us to identify many interactions that are impacting the movement behavior that we see, right? What systems are doing what constraints are impacting what I'm seeing, right? Which type of locomotion do I use at what point in my lifespan? And what decides that? What drives that change in motor pattern? Okay. So in the previous chapter we looked at creeping, they skipped crawling in that one. So crawling is like a commando crawl or a seal crawl where the baby is pulling itself along on its tummy and its legs are on the floor, right? So some babies will do that action, pulling themselves along on their tummy. Remember that there are environmental constraints of surface type, space around in which to move, okay? So then we get to the point where the baby can get up around 7 months, remember, up onto its hands and knees, and I mentioned that rocking behavior. So let me show you the rocking behavior. Don't forget that all these video clips are at your book website, so you can always go back and watch them again and again, which is never a bad plan, because the more you watch the video, the better sense everything makes. Okay, here we go. So I would say that baby's actually a little bit younger than 7 months. And here's the rocking that I was telling you about on Tuesday. So it manages to get up on its hands and knees, and then the brain's like, now what, right? Okay. So what has to happen here is the brain has to be able to uncouple the limbs. Okay. So let's think about how the brain's organized. So we have 2 hemispheres in the brain. The left hemisphere is responsible for controlling the right side of the body. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. All right? So when we're very young, it's much easier for the brain to work as a whole. And so we see 2 hands moving together, or we see 2 legs kicking together. Right? When we get to this point and we want to start to creep and move my hands and knees, my brain has to start to work out, okay, how do I only turn on the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere? Right? So it has to uncouple the two hemispheres. And then it will move hand and leg. Eventually, it also has to uncouple the limbs, right? Because eventually, I want to be able to move one hand without the leg going at the same time, right? So it looks very simple when you watch a little baby transition to creeping, right? But it is hugely complicated for the brain. Okay. This one shows this child rolling over and getting up and creeping away. So you can watch that one on the website. So after the initial self-locomotion pattern, whichever one the baby goes with, right, then we get to walking. And walking is, for a human, typically our first form of upright bipedal locomotion. It's the first time we walk just on two, or we locomote just on two limbs. Okay? And walking is a 50% phasing pattern, so that means that each leg does 50% of the work in a walking pattern. Right? And there has to be a period of two-footed support. So I pick my foot up, I swing my leg, I have both feet on the ground before I push off my back foot, swing my leg, both feet on the ground, push off the back foot, swing my leg. All right? So it's 50% phasing because each leg is doing the same thing and has half the job to do for the skill. And we have this double support phase. All right? So once the baby starts walking, then we see some similar developmental stages to the running stages that you have on your MSU chart. All right, so initially the baby will walk with its feet very wide, kind of waddles rather than walks, takes a long time to actually move forwards, because the brain doesn't want the baby to stand on one foot for a long time to get the other foot further forwards, right? It wants to keep the child on balance as much as possible. Typically the hands will be up quite high, so it's like a two-footed version of our running pattern that we have on our MSU chart, right? As we get older, once we're walking with a adult form or a competent form, then usually what we see is the underlying timing in an individual's walking pattern stays the same, even though there might be some changes in constraint as they get older, right? So it's difficult to explain that without a biomechanics lab, but it means that their timing of their pattern doesn't change, although the force production of their pattern may change because they've got a knee injury or a hip injury, or they've lost some muscle mass and they're not as strong as they were, right? So we might see someone get stronger and take longer, faster steps, and then as they get weaker, they take shorter, slower steps. But the timing between the limbs stays similar. So, early walking, right? The goal is not to fall over, right? So I want to be as stable as I can be. I'm not particularly worried about how mobile I am, right? So arms up, feet out, possibly toes turned out. The force production is going straight down into the floor. I'm pushing down, which means the floor is pushing up, which means I get this kind of gait. I'm not yet pushing backwards so that I move forwards very well. Okay. So my rate controllers here, my rate limiters, my rate controllers, are going to be strength in my legs, right? Because if I'm going to start moving forwards, I have to A, be able to push down and back, and B, I have to stand on one leg for longer to take a step, right? So strength and balance are considered the rate limiters, the rate controllers for walking. Right? Got to develop a critical level of strength and a critical level of balance in order to independently move these legs and take a longer step forwards. I have to show you this one because she is just so cute. She has the most lovely smile on her face. This will brighten up your day. Here we go. Oops. She's taking quite long steps. Her arms are down, so she's been walking for quite a while. She's also able to kind of be off balance and going all over the place because she's laughing so hard and not fall over. Right? Oops. Look at that face. So cute. Okay. I would have liked to have seen her in bare feet and not in those shoes so I could see what her feet were actually doing, but she's probably been walking for several months. So with practice, same idea as our fundamental motor skill stages, right? We see developmental stages. Okay? So with practice, the goal becomes to move forwards more efficiently, right? So to do that, I have to trade off stability and mobility. So we have a stability and mobility trade-off, right? When I begin, I'm not, well, the brain is not worried about being so mobile, it wants to make sure I'm not falling over. As I get more proficient, as I get more experienced at walking, now I want to get where I'm going, right? So I have to increase the stride length, I have to reduce my base of support because I'm going to go from nice wide base to 1 foot, right? And remember our cephalocaudal development, their feet are very small in relation to this top heavy head that they've got, right? So reducing the base of support challenges the balance immensely, right? And once I start taking a long enough step, it takes a while, right? Initially, we're going to see a longer step, but the hips are going to stay square onto the direction, right? And so it's still not going to be as long a step as possible. Once we're more confident in our balance, then I can take a longer step and we start to see some hip and pelvis rotation, right? And we'll get opposition arm swinging, right? So initially, we're going to get opposition because of our Newton's laws, right? Because this leg is swinging forward, the other arm automatically, equal and opposite reactions, swings. And then that becomes more coordinated and deliberate, right? We're also looking at the feet. Are they walking flat-footed, or are they starting to heel strike and then roll across their foot and push off of their toe? Right? So that's another characteristic that we can be looking for. So after about 3 years of practice, remember the average age of starting to walk is around 12 months. So after about 3 years of practice, we expect most of the components of the motor pattern to look competent, advanced. Okay? We see a little bit more improvement up until around 5 that we can identify visually, and then changes start to become more subtle, right? And we would need more sophisticated equipment to see changes after the age of 5. So let's see, in older adulthood, then walking is very stable, right? Walking as a motor pattern, once we get to 5, 4, 5, 6, walking is a very stable motor pattern. Unless something dramatic happens, my walking pattern is going to continue into my later adulthood, right? Once we get into our later adulthood, now we start to see some changes. So not in your age group, unless you've got an injury or you're not well, right? Your walking pattern doesn't change very much, right? Unless it's very perturbed, perhaps by the environment, like if there's ice on the floor, right? But in older adulthood, the priorities start to shift again, right? So the older I get, the more important it becomes to maintain my balance and my stability. And I'm less worried about mobility and getting anywhere in a hurry. Okay? Whether that's conscious or not, that's what the brain is working with, right? It doesn't want you to fall. And so what we now see is the reverse of what happened earlier on. Now we start to decrease mobility and increase stability in the pattern. So some older adults will start turning their feet slightly outwards because that increases the base of support. The stride length starts to shorten and the hip rotation starts to come back to a neutral square-on position, right? And speed decreases for several reasons. One is it's easier to maintain your balance if you're going slowly. 2, remember, we're losing some muscle mass, and that would impact force production and speed as well, right? And then often, older adults get to a point where they need to resort to a third point of contact, whether that's a hand on the back of the chair or on the handrail on the stairs, whether it's a walking stick, right? As soon as I add a third point of contact, I dramatically increase the base of support and make myself much more stable. Okay? It's really important for older adults to maintain as much strength as possible in their legs, right? Because as long as their legs are really strong, they're not going to need this third point of support, and they may not need to resort to a walking cane or something like that, you know, or even a walker. Okay? Can I do enough physical activity to maintain the strength in my legs? Right? how do we introduce a program to older adults to help them get a little bit stronger in their legs, right? Because some older adults can't actually even stand up out of the chair. Okay, so that's pretty limiting, right? If I can't get up and down out of my chair on my own, I can't go make myself a cup of coffee, right? I have to wait for everybody to help me. I can't be very independent. So it's really important psychologically and physically that we keep the legs as strong as we can and help people maintain their independence. So, rate controllers in older adults, remember, is going to be the system that deteriorates to the critical point where it impacts the motor pattern. So, what else other than strength might occur in older adults that could influence their walking pattern? Right? What else could be a rate limiter or a rate controller? Can be anything individual, right? So it could be a structural constraint, a functional constraint. Isaiah, what do you think would be a rate limiter for older adults? Adriana? Any ideas? Okay, well you guys need to do some thinking while you're reading, because I'm going to expect some ideas next Tuesday on what could be rate limiters for older adults. So either structural and or functional constraints that might act as a rate limiter for older adults' walking patterns. So typically the next locomotor pattern that we see is running, and running generally, again an average kind of picture that we're looking at is about 6 months after the infant started walking. So on average around 18 months, a year and a half, is when we start to see running. Running is also mechanically a 50% phasing, so each leg does half the work to create the motor pattern, right? However, a big difference between running and walking is that for it to be defined as a run, there has to be a flight phase, right? There has to be a period of time where both feet are off the floor, and that flight phase is followed by landing on one foot and I have a single leg support, right? So there's a lot more strength involved. I have to be strong enough to push myself up off the floor against gravity. and I have to be strong enough to land on one leg and maintain my balance and keep running. So with our early running patterns, like we can see on our MSU chart, the brain reverts back to, okay, I need to be stable before I work on being mobile. So we get these old behaviors that we saw at the beginning of walking, like we have on our MSU chart. The arms are up high, there's a limited step length, right? The stride is very short, there's lots of up and down movement. Okay, there's not a lot of rotation going on, and I'm running without a lot of forward movement. Okay. So when we look at the transition from walking to running, then coordination is not one of our rate limiters. Right? Because the 50% phasing is the same for running and walking, right? So the rate limiters for the transition to occur are my strength and my balance. As we get more experience, get more proficient as we practice, okay, same skill, practice. If we want to get better at anything, we have to practice, whatever the skill is, whether it's schoolwork or a pole vault or throwing a football, right? We have to practice to get better at it. As we practice, then we are less concerned with stability and more concerned with mobility, it's running. The whole point of running is I want to get from point A to point B faster than I can by walking, right? Otherwise we wouldn't need to develop running, okay? So we have to get strong enough to apply enough force down and back to increase stride length. We've got to have enough strength to land from a height now. It's not just stepping onto one foot. Right now I'm coming down out of the air and landing on one foot. So I have to develop enough strength to manage that action, okay? And develop oppositional arms, hopefully. Right? Remember, we don't see oppositional arms until about stage 4 in fundamental running. Right. Okay, what have I got here? All right, I'm going to stop there. And we will keep going on Tuesday, and on Tuesday we are going to start looking at the observation plans in the textbook that are connected to your next assignment. All right? So if you have time over the next few days, try to read ahead and have a look at some of those observation plans so that you maybe have some questions for next Tuesday about how those work and how to create them. Okay? Any questions?
No, ma'am.
Okie dokie. We did go and film TGMD skills for you to analyze for lab. We just weren't sure how to get them. We downloaded them to the computer, but we're not quite sure how to get them from the computer into media sites so that you can watch them and do your analysis. but I have contacted Distance Learning this morning, and they will send us the procedure to transfer that. So keep an eye out on Blackboard today. There should be some film clips coming up for you to start your TGMD analysis in lab. Okay? All right. So that's your job for tomorrow's lab class. Okay?